Hi, my name is Cameron Williams, and this is a guide on the differences between SharePoint and OneDrive and when to use them. Any business pretty much has some kind of an email system, and most people these days either use G Suite or Office 365 as their email host. So assuming your email host is Office 365, this video is for you. So let's jump right into it. What is OneDrive? So OneDrive is basically just like any other personal file sharing software like Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, or OneDrive itself. However, obviously, since Microsoft is the enterprise business cloud provider out there, other than G Suite and maybe a few others, they need to have a piece of software that's for personal files, for backing up, and we'll get more into that later. It's a piece of software that allows you to sync files and folders from multiple devices across one another, so that you're accessing your files that you work on consistently or need to bring up, or maybe you need to look at some kind of a spreadsheet while you're off at a meeting at somebody else's location. OneDrive allows for synchronization of those files across multiple devices. It's also a web portal. There is also a web portal so that you can access those files, but at the end of the day, it's really intended to be used as the piece of software installed on your computer. Like I said, it's a piece of software. Once you sign in, it shows up in the File Explorer window just like your Documents folder might, with little synchronization icons, for synced, not synced, etc., which we'll get more into in another video. Whereas SharePoint is essentially it replaces your need for a file server. It would throughout a series of different sites, it would essentially manage all of your company's data as a central repository. They call them, one of the features of it is called a document library, among other things. So this view is, once you click on the SharePoint button from the portal, when you log into office.com, this is an example series of different team sites that have been set up. So there's, a site for IT, there's a site for marketing, there's a site for the executives, products, etc., etc. So we would essentially create a different team site for each of the departments in your organization, and then there would likely, but not necessarily, be one large, centralized site that everyone has access to that could potentially be public-facing, but most people don't end up using it for that. Once you go into one of those sites, this is an example of one of those team sites. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a documents section. And let's say this was a HR team, and there were 3 members, like you can see up top here. The HR documents related to the HR department would be found here in the Documents tab. You can even have subpages, which if maybe you wanted to break out HR into subsites, as you'll see here. So you have your general site collection, which is everything. You have, let's say, an operations site and an HR and career site. Inside of the HR career site, that could break down into multiple subsites, benefits, job openings, etc. And then one of those subsites can have its own, like you saw on the left there, the document library. There's also a feature called Tasks or Planner, which I'll get into in another video. There's a calendar associated with the team, and there can be like an announcement homepage. And yeah, so that's the major differences between OneDrive and SharePoint. Many of the features exist in both environments, but OneDrive is intended for files that just you're working on, or maybe files that, while they're being drafted, need to remain private. And even like personal expense forms or something that's truly just intended for you can live in OneDrive, but it's intended for work-related things. There's also some features around automatically synchronizing your desktop documents, etc. But again, I'll get into that in another video. But that's the primary differences between OneDrive and SharePoint and when to use them. To kind of get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, if you're curious, if that was enough for you, you're welcome to stop the video now. But in terms of ownership, SharePoint is something that that belongs to the team. If you're in HR, that folder belongs to HR. However, if you're in HR and maybe you're working on your own timesheet, that would probably want to live in your OneDrive until you're ready to submit it. From a permissions management, SharePoint is centrally managed. That would be by us, PCS. And they're essentially inherited from parent sites, et cetera, et cetera. It's It's a process that we would collaboratively determine with administration around how different sites should be structured and who should have access to what, etc. OneDrive, everything in there you own. There's some control stuff that we can do around, I don't know, say restricting certain file types or file sizes, etc. But generally speaking, you control who has access to files in there. There are sharing features in both SharePoint and OneDrive, and they behave very, very similarly. But long story short, you can grant access to both folders and or files in either scenario, SharePoint or OneDrive. In terms of collaboration, SharePoint is obviously if you have like a whole team of people working on a document, you want to probably have that document be in SharePoint for you to be collaboratively editing. However, if there's something that you're working on yourself and maybe you just want a little bit of help on one aspect, it could live in your OneDrive and you could just invite somebody else to have collaborative access to that document, and you can work in that with them simultaneously. So I compare it, it's almost exactly like Google Docs where people will simultaneously do collaborative editing. So maybe one person in a Word document will be working on page 1 and another person will be working on page 2, while another person's going through and doing formatting. Who knows how you want to structure it. And then finally, in terms of access, SharePoint is almost always accessed from the browser. However, there is some features available in OneDrive that allow you to synchronize SharePoint libraries. SharePoint is only a cloud portal. OneDrive has a cloud portal, but it's really more of a piece of software. And that architecture that software leverages and utilizes can also be leveraged by SharePoint to synchronize directories down to your computer. I'll get into a whole bunch of videos about how that exactly works later. In terms of privacy, this is similar to permissions, but essentially permissions are inherited from the directory or folder above unless you set explicit permissions, which again, all that would be managed by us and co-decided upon by us and your administration. Whereas in OneDrive, everything you put up there by default is private unless you decide to share it with somebody else. And then in sharing, which I went into a little bit before, everyone who's a member of a team site has access to everything on the team site unless there's explicit permissions set, but you can share anything from that site unless restricted otherwise with anyone in the organization. And if we open up the settings, it can even allow you to share folders or files outside of the organization. Say you're working with a consultant and you need to collaboratively edit on either a specific file, or maybe you just want to create a folder that person has access to everything inside that folder so that they can dump their own stuff in there and collaboratively edit on some stuff in there with you and your team. In terms of sharing in OneDrive, it's kind of the same thing as the permissions. It's private until you decide to share it. And yeah. So this is kind of an infographic that I found that kind of lays it out. You're welcome to pause the video and read this if you so desire. But yeah, generally OneDrive is intended for stuff that's yours. SharePoint is, it breaks down into two categories of SharePoint. There's the general SharePoint site, which is company-wide. Many organizations don't utilize that at all. They just use team sites. But that would be the kind of publishing site, communication site. It's like your intranet, so you would have staff lists, contact lists, that kind of stuff. Cross-organization stuff would live there, and then everything that's department-specific would live in a team site. There's kind of a life cycle of how data might operate. Basically, this is, like I said, a lot of people just use team sites. Some people use that general site or an intranet, and there's some back and forth between there. But yeah, again, you're welcome to pause and read this in more detail if you want. I find it a little confusing. But yeah, some of the just general major features. Version history, it goes back something like 90 days for every version of a file, even if there's 100 of them, because 100 different people, or maybe the file was edited a whole bunch of times, and you can restore back to those prior versions. On that note, there's also a recycle bin, so if you accidentally delete a file or folder, it will go to the recycle bin. Also, it gives warnings to the administrator account, which would be us, if anyone tries to delete a significant number of files. So, if somebody goes in and tries to delete 100,000 files, we'll get a notice and we can go in and recover that data pretty quickly. Sync for offline access, that's both for OneDrive using the application syncing your own personal OneDrive stuff, but also if you decided to synchronize a SharePoint site, you can decide to keep files offline. So if you're going to go traveling on vacation and you want to work on some files while you're not connected to the internet, that's totally an option, and it's very much so a feature. Co-authoring, like I said, collaborative editing, external sharing, I got into that a little before, just allowing you to share access to files outside of your organization. Mobile access, there's an app for all of it. So there's an app for OneDrive, there's an app for SharePoint, etc. Permissions, again, we can get very granular with that if we desire. Hopefully we can keep it pretty top-down so that each team site, anything that belongs on one site, everyone who's a member of that team should have access to it. If we need to restrict like one administrative folder for the director of that, maybe either that should live in their OneDrive, or we can set explicit permissions. That's no problem. There's drag and drop functionality between all of it, and there are some limitations on like file types, file names, and total size. But when we get into the conversation around, if you haven't already migrated, when we get into the conversation around migrating, that's when we would get into that. And that's all. Thank you.